Hey everybody.
Hey.
Hey, Maya.
um,
Hey.
so yeah, as we kind of like as people roll in, as the people in the hundreds roll in, we just we're obviously like Cameron, this is Cameron over here.
Hi.
Hey, Cameron.
We're huge advocates of the chat too. So depending on your communication style, in the chat, if you want to share your name, preferred pronouns, and where you live, just to like kind of begin to get to know each other. I actually don't know where a lot of you live, so this would be cool. Melissa. Hi, Tracy. Yeah, and so also you guys can hear me fine, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I thought I heard an echo. Yeah, so since people are gonna come in later are not gonna see that intro slide, doesn't matter. Okay, so we're hijacking community conversations from the Venture Cafe team, and we're just it's really experimental. We're just trying out having conversations that relate generally to the themes of Venture Cafe. Fortunately, the themes of Venture Cafe are usually fairly general. So like we have this liberty to kind of, hi, Bruce, to sort of jump in and out of the themes and kind of zoom in or zoom out. So the whole idea of community conversations, as Cameron and I have sort of taken it over, is really about like developing this capacity for dialogue, which is why I have this really cool comic over here that really is like, it's kind of hyper focused more on the question itself rather than the answer. The answer is cool, but like the question we think is more one, inviting, and then is more compelling as you continue to ask questions. So we're each going to kind of share like what brought us to want to do this community conversation. And for me, it's very much about practicing facilitating conversations. I think we all know like the time that we're in, and some people have exiled family members because you couldn't have a conversation. Other people have learned a lot about friends or family through conversations that were hard to have. We're not necessarily interested in having like super divisive conversations, although that happens. Like what we're trying to do is build the capacity to be able to dialogue about things so different perspectives can actually have a conversation, right? And for me, I think that's one of the hardest things to do, but the most important things as humans to figure out. And so, Cameron and I talk about a lot of things just as friends a lot. And so we were like, let's just try this. Let's try this thing. So I would encourage, like, I'm practicing facilitating these. So what I would like to do is to be given some liberty to be able to kind of work on my own facilitation by, saying like, if you're sharing your thoughts, I would like to encourage you to end everything in a question or have a question sort of within your thoughts to help to continue to build the conversation. If we all just make a series of statements, sometimes it's hard to have a conversation. I've also been criticized in my life for asking, most of my dialogue with people has been questions, and they're like, why do you always ask all these questions? I'm like, well, we're still talking, aren't we? But yeah, Cameron, do you want to share a little about kind of what brought you to want to do this?
Yeah. I think that I think through, I guess, very briefly, I mean, I used to work in a vaccine lab doing like molecular biology and basic biology stuff as a lab tech and a research assistant. And so at the current moment, I'm a carpenter, actually, doing something totally different. But I think a lot about technological issues, social issues, environmental activism, various things. And I often try to like speak to people who aren't, or just my friends and relatives and people I might meet, and bring conversations that are very technical or they seem very niche to people who don't know much about them, and try to generate conversation. So I'm really interested in this space because it seems like a space where we can do that. And hopefully, again, I echoing what Maya said, like fostering how to build dialogue with people who don't know each other, and how to approach speaking about technology and society in a way that strips away some of the terminology and gets to concepts and really like gets to how people relate to things. Because I think that oftentimes people actually know a lot more than they think they do about these topics. And so I'm really interested in just participating in this. And I think another thing is to also develop my skills in facilitation and in participating in dialogues too. I'm pretty humbled to be asked to be here, so I'm excited to learn a lot from everyone and keep conversations going. Yeah.
We're really glad that you're here.
Thanks.
Yeah, so we can jump right in, or if anybody, I know everybody who's here. Cameron, this is Bruce. I'm not sure. Bruce used to run Graphene, which is a lab right next to Firsthand. Seems like so long ago now, Bruce, doesn't it?
Oh, yes, it definitely does.
I'll tell you what, though, we're still using some supplies that we got from your lab, actually.
Good.
Some Pyrex dishes, all kinds of stuff.
I'm
but
glad
anyway.
they're coming into good use.
Okay, so actually go ahead, Cameron. So we're gonna jump in and here we go.
Yeah.
Jump in at any time.
So I guess just to start, we were thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals, and the first place I came to was to look up the way that the UN defines what sustainable development is, and it's sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. And I think that there's a lot of interesting places to go with this. And we sort of like came up with two general questions, and then we want to relate them to Philadelphia. So the first question would be, how does a city shift to a community-centric, economically sound model? I guess we have a typo there, sorry. And then the second is, can we anticipate the needs of future generations? How can we put ourselves in the place of people who are 100 years into the future? And what we were thinking is that we could start the conversation by just having people type 1 or 2 based on which question they want to focus on. And I guess do we want to talk about the refinery now or wait until we kind of focus on a question?
I think we can start with kind of which, I just put them in the chat here. I think we can just focus on like, we're curious like what you're interested in talking about, even if just these 2 questions, which maybe feel kind of specific. But if you could just put 1 or 2 in the chat to be like, here's the direction I would like to lean, I think that would be helpful. Whoa, I lost my 2, we got a 1, we got a 2, we got a 2. Cool, we got lots of 2s. Hold on. I just lost being able to see you guys, so keep talking, Cameron.
Yeah, I guess we can start with 2. So we've been thinking about, do you want to switch to the refinery slide?
Back, okay.
Yeah, so we've been, the way that we were having a conversation last week about like thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals, which are fairly general and they seem very large, and they're things like ending poverty, providing education, providing health equity. They seem massive, and we were thinking about how do we give this context for Philadelphia. And the place that I came to was the Philadelphia Energy Solutions Refinery. I guess I could read the quote. This is a refinery, and again, I guess I want to preface this first by saying that I don't consider myself an expert on the refinery. I'm not really trying to give a presentation on that, but just as someone who's lived in Philadelphia for a number of years, I have always seen this object sort of looming in the background and have learned about various problems associated with it, issues, and then benefits that it has as well, according to jobs that it gave to people. So
Are you guys, is everybody here? Rochelle, it's so good to see you. Just want to call you out. Hey. I think about you often. It's great to see your face. Is everybody in the room, let's start, like, are you familiar with this massive refinery that's larger than Center City, Philadelphia? It's like 14, whatever. I'm so bad. I would say like 1400, like 14,000 square miles. No, that's huge. Does everybody know this? Have they seen it? Are they aware of this? Yes. Anybody who's like, I don't know anything about this space in Philadelphia.
I've seen it, but I have no idea what it does.
Yeah. So, well, it doesn't do anything anymore currently. Does anybody remember the explosion that happened in June of, it was last year, right? 2019, was it? No, it was 2020. Yeah. It basically like was a series of events that led the whole refinery that's been in existence for 150 years to shut down. They declared bankruptcy for the second time, and the city kind of also moved forward to just close it. And we thought this was a really interesting point to start the discussion, especially about thinking about the question that a lot of you wanted to sort of lead with, which was, can we anticipate the needs of future generations? How can we put ourselves in the place of people in 100 years in the future? Thinking about sustainability, sustainable growth in a space like the refinery. So yeah, I mean, I think some of those things are like, how do we investigate some of those ideas? And when we think about a space that's this big, how do we think about what that future could look like for that space? And being really transparent with the fact that a huge development company has already purchased a lot of that space, and thinking about like the future of industry, of community, right? Things, visioning, right, for what that future could look like in a sustainable way. Does anybody have any initial thoughts on that? Actually, I like this.
I can throw a thought. So my background's in like climate science and how it affects marine ecosystems. And I have a very pessimistic view of 100 years from now. So I have a hard time putting like imagining what people are going to be experiencing in 100 years, no matter how we treat properties like this and developments and, carbon emission things. So I have a hard time answering this question and don't think we can anticipate the needs of future generations. And let me think of you want me to ask a question, right? To lead.
Yeah.
People who have a more optimistic view of 100 years from now, I'm curious why and what you think the landscape will be like for humanity.
Ooh, calling out the optimists here. I think you asked two questions, Melissa. You asked like, you also asked, what are the needs of the generation 100 years from now? And does this space, how could this space serve those needs? I mean, that would be one question. And then the other is calling out any optimists in thinking about 100 years from now in a space like this.
I also want to think about the river, the plan of where the river is going to be in respect with rising sea levels in 100 years. That's something I've also thought about with this location.
I mean, I am a little bit optimistic for the future only because it seems like this new generation is way more thoughtful of sustainability and just more thoughtful in general. But I would say that nothing can really change unless the laws change about what's acceptable for these large businesses or, refineries. They have to be able, I don't think they're just going to all of a sudden change everything to be more environmentally friendly. I think there has to be like policy made so that they have to. And I guess I have to end that with a question.
You don't have to, but
Okay. I don't want to tack on a question that, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I'd like to jump in.
Yeah, go for it.
So I'm one of the few people in the room not in Philadelphia, but I'm very bullish on Philadelphia. And my observation is that we're revisiting the same question that got addressed in Philadelphia back in the 1700s during the Constitutional Congress. Was the nation going to follow Puritan Boston or Quaker Philadelphia? And so that meant, was it going to follow an orthodox approach where things are right or wrong, or is it going to follow orthopraxic Quaker Philadelphia that instead of looking at what you think, looks at how you go about thinking? Technology is at an inflection point right now where the binary platform is obsolete. The binary platform takes three-dimensional realities, collapses it down to two oppositional poles, right and wrong, ones and zeros. But when we've got machine learning going on, then we are improving the process by which we process information. And when we've got an acceleration of the amount of data collected, all of a sudden, that data is becoming a source of energy. It's no longer a right and wrong kind of a thing. And in Philadelphia's DNA is this long history of looking at how people go about processing, how people think, and optimizing all of that. I mean, out of Philadelphia, you had some of the basic tenets of the nation. The Underground Railroad, was started at the Arch Street meeting there in Philadelphia. The women's suffrage movement, the notion of religious tolerance, the notion of fixed good at a fixed cost. And so these are all larger principles. And I think out of Philadelphia, they can revisit that DNA and start reinventing what technology is, rather than looking towards the past at a refinery. How do you go about taking the acceleration and all the data, turn that into a sustainable fuel source? And that gives you a path forward.
Right. So you're saying like thinking about the refinery in a new way that incorporates like actually where we are, because we don't need to use this much space for a refinery anymore, because we can think forward about the technology that is in our present and will be in our future.
Right. I mean, Philadelphia, the UN was initially slated to be in Philadelphia until Rockefeller donated the land to put it in New York City. What are here you've got this huge amount of land. What's lacking is what's the new vision that Philadelphia is going to be moving into that lifts everybody?
Totally. New vision. Tracy, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say that's a great question.
What is the new vision?
Yeah. What's the new vision for Philadelphia?
I'd like to add something in here too, that when in learning a lot about this refinery and thinking about it in the lens of sustainable growth, there's like this concept that Cameron and I have been talking a lot about, which is like, can there be an industry that does no harm, like as a sort of thought experiment? Because this refinery did a lot of harm to the community around it, and kind of sort of positioned itself to like, I mean, it sort of neglected, right, the community around it in the name of energy production, right? And I wonder if anybody has anything to say about like if there can be an industry physically in the space, or can we think about bringing industry into Philadelphia that does no harm? Take that as you want. Nothing
is real if it doesn't cast a shadow.
Anything's going to have, any industry or anything has an impact. You of course want it to be a net positive impact. but if you you put solar cells on a roof, somewhere it's casting a shadow. But that doesn't mean, but hopefully it's more a net positive than a net negative. So I don't know. I'm optimistic. I'm an optimistic person about the future. But yeah, I don't know where I can go with trying to go further with this question. But one plus, I guess, you have for say for redeveloping this property or turning into something else is that there aren't many things that can be worse than what it has been lately, to be honest. So anything, frankly, virtually anything that'll clean up the space is a positive. I guess mostly the plan right now is, I guess, to turn it into a big warehouse area, which is just logistics warehouse, which is not something I particularly like. It's something to do because it doesn't, it doesn't provide much in the way of jobs or opportunity or build on much. But even that, and hopefully something better will come out of it instead, or something better will come up instead. But even that, if it cleans up the space, is better than what it is now.
Bruce, do you have any if you could ask the redevelopment company a question, what would it be?
I would say that, I would ask, and I don't know how much this is just the redevelopment company or to anything in general, is that, this big a property in a city in Philadelphia is a virtually unique proposition. And I'm sure other cities have big properties like this that have been developed, but certainly in Philadelphia, some space this big with an opportunity to redevelop and reimagine an area of the city, that does not come around often. I'm sure this hasn't come around in at least 50 years in Philadelphia, if not longer. And I would really say that, is this the best thing you can do with it? Would be the first thing, but really imagine what could be done better. Find a problem that we can, that can be solved. And maybe warehouse distribution things is really, a much bigger problem than I imagined it to be with that for need to be solved locally. But I give examples that, recycling is currently broken in this country. It is fundamentally not working. This place might be a good opportunity to have a recycling facility that could be innovative and do a better job of recycling than we are now. Whether it's whether it's through better recycling of plastics or reusing of other countries, rather than recycling glass bottles, they reuse them. But
Yeah.
that probably is a long time to go, and you can't really do that just in one city.
And I think that gets at who the space is for. And I wonder, thinking about that idea of the recycle, let's say the whole community wanted this to be a recycling center instead, so we actually could recycle the things that we think we are recycling. Is it possible for industry or a recycling center to be outsourced, come in and actually sort of I'm thinking a lot about how local things have to be for them to not do harm or be smart resources for the community, right? How much of that has to be driven by the community, and can industry come in from anywhere and actually be effective at meeting the needs, like Melissa was saying, of the future generations?
My opinion is that in theory they can be. Whether or not they choose to be is something else. And that's another unusual thing about this space, is that it's, if you're say the chocolate factory on Washington Avenue that got sadly torn down. and they're going to be turning that into condos or whatever it is. That's clearly a space in the middle of a neighborhood. This space is the size of many neighborhoods. There are neighborhoods on the edge of it. And I've known a lot of people who live actually in some South Philly, kind of right near the refinery, or relatively near the refinery. But for the most part, this is I think you have to think about it differently in that you're not thinking about just the local neighborhood neighboring it, which you obviously should think about it, but you have to think more broadly about the larger neighborhood, which is largely the whole city. I mean, this is a very large space and with a very large footprint and a very large impact. But I mean, I'm sure that their companies can do things well, or some places are more idealistic than others. Some companies are. That's one of the things that makes me more optimistic about the future, is that I believe that people are thinking ethics getting into the thoughts about everything is becoming more common phenomenon. Whether it's, my background's in engineering, and discussing ethics and engineering is infinitely more common now than it was when I was in school. And people think about a lot of these things much more often, much more so. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'll get into the question of anyone throwing out ideas. What would, how would be a good way to positively impact communities? Any specific ideas or needs to things to be met?
This also goes back to David's point about how we think about space. Like, how are we thinking about sustainable growth, right? So not just, here's a space, what do we do with it? What do we put on it? What do we need to add to the city? Like, how are we thinking about development and growing a city as like a living thing, right? In a way, which is hard. I don't know if you have anything else to say about that, David, like how we think about it.
Well, when Philadelphia was first organized, they took that peninsula between the Delaware and the Schuylkill rivers and went down and then took the largest city known to Western civilization at that point, which was London, and placed it where London would fit between the two rivers. And that's originally how it got placed where it was. Here you've got an area that is even larger, that allows you to imagine creating a new Philadelphia right next door. But, envisioning as far into the future as you can, and then turn around and look back with 2020 hindsight, what would you go and create there? I had a course when I was at Penn that they just took some of the brightest teachers, the biggest names, and let them speak for 3 hours. It was Buckminster Fuller, it was Ian McHarg, who created Earth Day, okay? And back in the 70s, the mid 70s, way back in the dark ages, he was designing the capital of Europe for when the nations came together. That was long before anyone was ever talking about the EU. Philadelphia has this talent pool that it can draw upon to imagine into the future. What would a new Philadelphia look like? You've got an area larger than Center City to begin with. You don't get, major cities do not get opportunities like this. The question is, where's the leadership in Philadelphia? Not what goes on the land.
Where is the leadership in Philadelphia? Does anybody who hasn't said much want to contribute anything? Hear any questions? You don't even have to make statements. You can just make new questions.
Well, I think it's interesting. So I grew up in North Jersey, so I'm more familiar with like New York City. But when I think about when you drive into New York City, there's a very similar, I don't know if it's a refinery, But it looks like the Great Gatsby when you're going in, and you see all of the polluted areas. And I guess I just think about the larger question of, I know we're focusing on Philadelphia, but the larger question in America is that our cities sprang up in ways that European cities did not. And so all of the gunk of a city was kind of an afterthought. And so you have these huge areas that are just gross and polluted. And I think I'm typically an optimistic person about where we are thinking now, what Bruce was saying about where engineering is and how it's so much more green and driven by ethics and thinking about the future. But think about what has to be undone in the area first when you think about how much has been polluted already. And that to me is the larger problem, and I think makes it a much bigger project.
I think for me that goes to some of what was coming up in the chat, and it was making me think of this just idea of it's a space that's the largest possible experiment of how to fix the problem of having burned fossil fuels for 150 years. It's just, before you even think of how to reconnect it into the economy, we can just sort of sit and think, what do we do? This could be a visionary site in a way for new technologies or new approaches, and sort of those ideas of Philadelphia as a birthplace of things that are new. I'm really interested in the idea that came up in the chat that I saw that said, sort of like, is there a way to look at the people, maybe the people most impacted, getting a decision-making stake in how things go forward? And how does the social world interact with the questions of development and things like that? Like, how do we place the people that are really impacted by the problems at the center of the decision-making process? I wonder about that a lot.
I step back and I when I saw the description of the session, I kind of wasn't
Tracy,
sure.
I can't hear you that well for some reason.
You know what?
Yeah, it's buzzy.
You're really far away.
Can you hear me better now?
No.
Okay, I'm gonna log out and log back in.
Okay.
Oh wait, it's getting a little better.
Oh.
Yeah, it came back.
Oh no.
All right, we'll see you in a sec. I think so there's the social that Cameron brings up and how we think about the great experiment that this space could be, which is also kind of a thing that connects to the leadership question of like, who do we let run this experiment, right? Like, who is that? Because that's very social, very tied into like who has been a leader in this space. There was leadership that decided this was the great experiment for this space, 150 years ago up until last year. But also I want to address in the chat, like, Melissa's point, should we prioritize cleaning up this site and really thinking about it as like I'm going to paraphrase what you said, Melissa, and think about like cleaning it up and almost making it a productive space, if really thinking about the future is considering how much of that space will even exist as a usable space, right? And thinking, should we be shifting that focus onto not what do we put here? We have all this vacant land because we're sort of like obsessed with this idea of land and doing something with it. But do we actually just think about cleaning it up for the sake only of cleaning it up?
I mean, I think to clean something up like that, it involves lots of money. And, there's all these super fun sites in Philly that have just been sitting there for 20 years because no one can afford to clean them up. So, I mean,
Rochelle also, yeah. Go ahead, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, Rochelle also earlier in the chat asked about the brownfield designation, which is the same thing that you're describing. And I would assume it would have to be designated brownfield because there's like all kinds of wells of Cam. Do you remember what that was? Like that caused cancer? Cam benza something. It's got to be a brownfield site.
Yeah, I mean, typically those sites just sit there. You know, I mean, I don't know who's in charge of cleaning them or who has to pay for it, but it's got to be like a huge cost. So I think that's the question first.
How to do it.
Yeah.
When I think Bruce brought up something that was on my mind in the chat when he said that because it costs so much to clean it up, that there has to be this plan of, you know, what we're going to do with it, because it's so hard for someone to get on, or, you know, when you need so much fun to be like, we're just going to clean it. Oh, well, what are we going to do? We're not going to do anything with it. And so it's, and yeah, just amplifying that, because that was definitely something on my mind, how difficult of a pitch that would be, of like, I think we should just, you know, pour money into this place that could be washed away. And, you know, if your argument is that it's a valid argument that there would be hazardous materials in the waterways, but I don't know how much of a priority that is for leadership, given everything that's currently going on with the environment, which is upsetting. But it's, you know, it is a grim reality right now that isn't always a strong enough motivator for leadership.
If there's not a vision of highest and best use, then developers are going to resort to the lowest common denominator of not clean it up and just put things in that space that don't require them to clean it up, such as warehouses. But if there's a highest and best use that really is a huge economic driver, then all of a sudden that makes sense to go ahead and clean up the space. Now, as for the potential flooding in the future, all of Rotterdam is at an elevation of 0 feet. And here you are 60 miles in from the opening to the ocean. So that area has to be higher than Rotterdam is. And if the Netherlands can figure out how to do it, then Philadelphia should be able to figure out how to do something that's 60 miles in from the ocean.
To answer Tracy in the chat, definitely Venture Cafe needs to take on this project in kind of visioning for the future. I mean, the truth about this is, right, there is this development company that I don't know if they actually purchased the entire space, but the idea is that it's sort of like a manufacturing hub and it will be cleaned up as needed, which I think is very controversial, because if you think, it's not very forward thinking in the sense of like planning for 100 years, right? Like, I love where this conversation is going, in the sense of like thinking about land as being productive is where we are, you know, in the sense of like, what does it mean to be productive? Does it actually, is there a framework in thinking about this where it could be productive by actually just doing the remediation? And that comes back to Emily, your point, like, well, is there a way to rethink economic productivity or something like that in a way where cleaning it up would be to the greatest good, the greatest advantage? It's really, are we trapped within like an economic lens here? Yeah.
Can you guys hear me? Good. Looking at this site and thinking about what was there, it reminds me of a lesson from Philadelphia's past. The Port Richmond neighborhood in Philadelphia 40, 50 years ago was considered an extremely undesirable place to live. You had allied chemicals, you had slaughterhouses, a bunch of smaller chemical plants, some sewage treatment places. They would just smell. And that made it undesirable. It was considered a step below Kensington, if you think about that. The place where people from Kensington moved out of to get away from, you know. And over the years, I remember as a kid going along Aramingo Avenue, and there would just be puddles of chemical waste in the gutters of the streets. I was always fascinated by all the little crystals that formed. Yeah, well, these chemical compounds that are probably extremely toxic, were just everywhere. And what the city did, and I don't know if it was a good choice or not, getting back to some of the points we're making about just cleaning up versus covering up, is when the plants got closed down, they never really cleaned anything up. What they did was just cover it up along Aramingo Avenue, north of Allegheny. It's now all strip malls. Now the shopping and what was needed for the neighborhood, but nothing ever really got done. They just paved over everything. And I suspect that if this development or developer who has access to this property is left unchecked, that's probably what he will do. It might be warehouses. It may be more shopping areas, but it will definitely be choices that do not involve really cleaning up and addressing the problem. But one good thing at least would be if the refinery's gone and some surface cleanup is done, the neighborhoods around there will be more viable as desirable places to live. At least more desirable than they are now, or have been. That was it. It was just
Well, thanks for contributing. Yeah. Two things I want to shout out from the chat here. I think, Bruce, I appreciate your point of like, I think everyone believes the city would benefit if it were cleaned up, but it still costs money, the city's perpetual problem. I like David Beckett framing this and like how we think about this, because I think it's something we can actually keep going back to, which it's made me think. I couldn't type fast enough in the chat and listen. I'm like, this multitasking thing's hard. But I think how we think about value, land value, because Bob, your point's really interesting, right? Like you have all these Port Richmond property values that have just like skyrocketed and exploded because, you know, everybody wants to buy a townhouse there, right? Or a row house there. And, you know, and I think it's funny to think about the value of that land being just based on what you can build on it, but not what the environmental value of that land. And I wonder if there's a way we could actually shift the way we think about land value in this way. I mean, actually, I think it would cause more disparity in Philadelphia because, you know, Sunoco, Atlantic Petroleum, the companies that took over the refinery have destroyed land around it. And so poorer communities often are sort of the brunt of this, or you know, who would eventually just have land that was undervalued. But it's interesting for me to think about how you incorporate environmental component into productivity and value of space.
I wonder if there's any kind of data that like shows any health effects of living near this site over time. I mean, I don't know of any that exists, but I feel like that would be something, you know, very informative.
I think
There are
at
a
least
lot of
that. I don't know if they have what the evidence was.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was. I remember reading about it, but I don't know how really in depth they try and look at health issues of, you know, nearby neighborhoods versus similar neighborhoods that are further away and things like that. But it's a messy thing to try and figure out.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to consider that public health framework and thinking about this of how much it's costing the city, all of the medical expenses and all the health issues. But I think at the end of the day, the other complicated part of this is who is being affected and who is advocating for them, because more often than not, these are communities of color, these are underserved communities anyway. And so you think about, you know, David, I think it was you that mentioned, or, you know, who is at the table, who the leadership is on these projects, and who they're advocating for, and who, you know, who cares about these issues and, you know, resolving them for X, Y, and Z group. But I think the health component is a really important one.
So rephrasing that just a little bit, a few years ago, I was interested in what was the very first virtual transaction. because that's the beginning of all of computing. And it was actually a Philadelphia-based bank that's now Brown Brothers and Harriman. And what they did was they invented the letter of credit that came out of a social need that then became a commercial opportunity for them. When goods were produced in Philadelphia, they were shipped across the ocean to London, and payment was made at time of delivery. What Brown Brothers and Harriman did was said, let's have all the goods be of a fixed quality and a fixed price, treating everybody the same. And with that, then the banks were able to create a ledger entry where payment was made across ledgers rather than cash being handed to somebody and then piracy stealing those funds on the return trip. And so it increased safety. Everyone got treated equally, the whole bit. And so anyway, all that to say, all of the virtual world first came around by addressing social needs. And that's not how most business people think. But in this room, there's plenty of people that can come up with technological solutions and commercial solutions for business needs.
So one thing I'll mention, I'm unmuted, right? Yes, I am. Is that, and I don't think this is really the right solution for this piece of property, but I'll mention that if this property was all clean and had, say, a green flood zone / walkway or area around it, I mean, like something that looks like the Fairmount Park Schuylkill River area, and then the area and then along that was a whole lot of residential area, whether it's row houses or condos or whatever. This would be an unbelievably popular neighborhood property to live in. And the city does not have many waterfront neighborhoods at all, despite all the rivers around it. Right now, it looks like a mess. It also has incredible potential value. Of course, the city could certainly use a lot more, say, jobs rather than more houses, in my opinion. But it's has to look at what the potential of the space as opposed to what it looks like now or the headaches of it. And like anything you do to develop it, of course, is going to have its pluses and minuses, but I could view the potential of it. You could imagine it's not going to happen like this because it'd be a required demand of space. If this space was in Silicon Valley somewhere, someone would create a whole new city here with some idealized vision of a walkable green city with whatever light rail lines going around it and things like that. But of course, they also have unlimited money there, so they can do things like that.
Yeah, I think I just want to jump in, Bruce, because we're getting close to time, but I appreciate that. And I think that's really valid. It reminds me of the marshmallow experiment where it's like, where the kids they're like, you have one marshmallow here, you have two wait, what, how's it go? You have one marshmallow. If you can wait till I come back, I'll give you a second marshmallow. It's like the self-control experiment. It reminds me of this. If we can wait 100+ years, we could have the most beautiful space that was remediated. Can we do it? But yeah, Cameron and I wanted to, before everybody leaves, we really appreciate your contributions. This was so much more robust and vibrant than we were anticipating for the first one.
Definitely.
Yeah, Cam, do you want to talk about the next one and we can get some ideas before everyone leaves?
Yeah, we're really interested in the next session's going to be on cell and gene therapy. And I guess we were interested if people had specific topics and wanted to return to them, that they could reach out to us through email. And then I believe our emails are shared, and then we could look into setting up a conversation too. And we're also, one vision I think we have is to carry questions that we get in each discussion forward into the next ones and sort of like build a set of questions that might interrelate the different topics, even if it's not immediately obvious how those things work. So we're also interested in that as well.
Yeah, so jump back in, guys, because it's been great. We're gonna just keep this like building capacity for dialogue. So here's my email address. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Maya and Cameron. This was awesome.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you, Maya.
Thanks
Yeah.
everybody for chatting.
And thanks everyone for coming.